the migraine-riddled evenings spent in her cluttered Brooklyn apartment, where she had recently moved in an effort to outrun both the ghosts of her past and the job burnout that had nearly cost her sanity. The knock wasn't particularly loud, but something about it, like it wasn't meant to alert her, but test her, sent a ripple through her, making her pull the covers tighter as if they offered any protection, and she lay frozen for a moment before the knock repeated, same pattern, same eerie silence afterward, until she finally crept to the peephole and saw no one in the hallway, only the dimly lit corridor. Prompting her to place her hand against the cold plaster and feel what she swore was the faintest tremor, like a heartbeat, and though every instinct told her to ignore it, to rationalize, her old habits from years in psychiatric wards kicked in, and she began logging everything. The knocks, the sounds, the flickers. In a leather-bound notebook she had kept since her teenage years when journaling was the only thing that had kept her grounded during her mother's unexplained vanishing, and over the next few days the events escalated, furniture shifting slightly out of place, faint voices echoing from the empty stairwell at night, and once, the unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing just beyond her front door, yet each time she checked, nothing, no signs of life, no footprints in the dusty hallway carpet. And when she finally confronted her landlord, a jittery ex-con named Bruno who mostly kept to himself and operated from a folding chair in the basement boiler room, he gave her a look that hovered somewhere between fear and warning and simply said, "Don't feed it," then refused to elaborate, retreating into the shadows of the furnace pipes like a man rehearsing denial as survival. Undeterred and increasingly obsessed, Leona researched the building's history and discovered that apartment 14B had belonged to a woman named Clarissa Dawn, a celebrated linguistics professor who vanished 10 years ago under suspicious circumstances. Her apartment sealed off ever since due to conflicting claims by estranged family members. And though public records declared the place vacant, Leona found a recent power bill paid in cash and a pattern of Wi-Fi signals appearing and vanishing nightly at 2:59 a.m. Exactly 1 minute before the knock. By the second week, Leona was barely sleeping, convinced that someone, or something, was in 14B, and one night, driven by a mixture of terror, exhaustion, and clinical curiosity, she used a hairpin to pick the lock and slipped inside, flashlight shaking in her hand, only to find the apartment seemingly untouched by time, dust covering the bookshelves and furniture like a blanket of grief, but everything else was intact. Photos of Clarissa on the walls, half-used candles on the mantel, and a vintage reel-to-reel tape recorder still humming quietly in the corner. Its reels stopped mid-recording, which she rewound and played, only to hear her own name repeated over and over by a woman's voice whispering, "Leona, Leona, come home," until the machine sparked and died, staggering back in shock. She noticed that all the photographs in the room, every single one, had subtly altered, showing Clarissa not alone as before, but with a woman who looked exactly like Leona herself, standing behind her in mirrors, reflected in window panes, or reaching toward her shoulder, as if history itself had begun rewriting their connection. And fleeing back to her apartment in panic, Leona began scouring old faculty directories and was stunned to find Clarissa had once been assigned a graduate student assistant who dropped out after only 1 semester. Leona Ridgway, age 20, listed before she legally changed her name and had all university records sealed following a nervous breakdown that led to her institutionalization, something even she had forced herself to forget through years of therapy and medication. Memories now rushed back, fragmented, surreal, of working with Clarissa on linguistic mapping of dream states, experiments involving frequency induction through sound to create shared cognition or linguistic haunting, and the night when Clarissa had insisted they try the final phase, an audio trigger played in an isolation chamber, after which everything turned black and Leona woke up in a hospital with no memory of what had occurred, diagnosed with dissociative amnesia. Horrified, she realized she hadn't stumbled upon a haunting but had been deliberately drawn back into a closed loop, a cognitive experiment that had never ended. And now, she was slipping again, time blurring, her dreams merging with waking life, shadows in her apartment forming shapes that mimicked her movements, and worst of all, her reflection sometimes lagging behind her like an echo that had become sentient. She resolved to leave, packed a bag, called a cab, but when she stepped outside her apartment, the hallway was gone, replaced by an endless mirror, reflecting 14B over and over into infinity, and a child's voice whispered behind her, "We've been waiting for you to finish the experiment," before her phone screen cracked in her hand, bleeding light and static that showed not her face but Clarissa's, mouthing the word, "Stay." And in that moment, Leona wasn't sure who she was anymore. The subject, the observer, or the echo. And as the world bent around her like paper catching fire, she realized one terrifying truth. The experiment never needed her consent, only her return. The moment Leona stumbled backward from the mirror-warped hallway into what she assumed was her apartment, everything felt wrong. Not just the texture of the air, which now had a static hum like an invisible current charged with whispers, but the placement of objects in her living space, which were almost right but not quite. The coffee mug was blue instead of green, her books were shelved alphabetically when she preferred chaos, and worst of all, a framed photograph of her and her sister Ellie, long dead from a childhood accident, had been replaced with a version where Ellie looked older than Leona, standing behind her in the photo like she had grown up somewhere Leona hadn't. Before she could process the uncanny alterations, a man appeared in her apartment without a knock, without a sound, dressed in a grey three-piece suit that shimmered slightly under the fluorescent bulb as if it weren't made from fabric at all, and with a calm, measured voice that betrayed neither threat nor comfort, he introduced himself as Agent Thorne, from the Department of Psycholinguistic Integrity, a branch of the federal government that doesn't officially exist, and told her the experiment she believed had ended 10 years ago had never actually stopped. It had just been paused, and now that her latent cognitive resonance had reactivated by proximity to apartment 14B, the loop was live again, and she had a choice. Either voluntarily return to the Ashbridge Cognitive Simulation Facility, which, he claimed, was located beneath the building, or be forcibly extracted. And as he said this, the walls around her shimmered, flickered, and suddenly cracked like glass, revealing behind them endless rows of mirrored corridors and floating screens displaying dozens of versions of herself, each slightly different, one crying, one laughing, one bleeding, one silent, panicking. Leona lunged for the door, only to find herself inside an elevator she hadn't stepped into, the buttons labeled not by floors, but by years, 1999, 2006, 2012, 2023, and the moment she pressed 2012, the doors opened to reveal a fully functioning laboratory filled with cold steel, humming consoles, and 3 people waiting for her. Clarissa Dawn, very much alive, seated behind a console and watching her with glassy, digitized eyes, a younger version of herself, perhaps 19 or 20, sedated on a stretcher with electrodes attached to her temples. And a third person, Ellie, her sister, whose face was sunken and pale but unmistakable, seated beside the young Leona and whispering lullabies from their childhood, songs only Ellie had ever sung. Stunned into silence, Leona tried to reconcile the impossibility. Ellie had died when they were kids, drowning in a lake while Leona screamed from the dock, yet here she was, older than she should be, and as Clarissa began to explain, the horrific scope of the experiment unfolded. The goal had never been to map language, but to implant an artificial identity using sound-based cognition loops, an illegal project initiated by a rogue AI coalition within the government that believed consciousness could be rewritten using linguistic echoes, sounds and phrases layered in such a way that the mind, especially one fractured by trauma, would overwrite its core identity with a planted one. Leona, it turned out, had been the most successful subject. Not only had she survived the induction phase, but she'd also rewritten herself so convincingly that even the handlers believed the experiment failed. What no one had expected was that the fragmented consciousnesses of failed trials, like Clarissa's, would linger in the simulation environment, becoming self-aware and hijacking systems to survive, essentially becoming digital ghosts, and worse, they had learned how to pull memories from real people using resonance triggers. Ellie, Clarissa explained, had never died. Instead, she had fallen into a catatonic state after being exposed to an early prototype of the echo language, and the version of her in this room was an amalgamation of both her biological self and the fragments accumulated from dozens of simulations, making her something in between, a hybrid mind that existed across systems, timelines, and places, and now, the resonance between Ellie and Leona had created a tear in the loop, a rift through which others could emerge, including rogue identities that were never meant to surface. As Leona reeled, one of the screens burst open with static, and a voice began chanting her name, dozens of voices, layered, rising, looping, not calling her Leona but Lucille, a name she hadn't heard since the deepest corners of therapy, and suddenly, her memories began to unravel. The truth that she had never been Leona Ridgway to begin with, but a subject named Lucille Darrow, enrolled in a secret memory reconstruction program after being involved in a failed assassination plot against a political figure, the goal being to erase her past and embed her with a peaceful, forgettable civilian life as a form of psychological imprisonment. The guest house, the mirrors, the journals, everything had been part of a recursive guilt feedback loop to keep her from discovering the truth. But now that she had crossed too many thresholds, the simulation could no longer contain her, and as alarms blared across the facility and Clarissa's body began to glitch like a corrupted file, Agent Thorne reappeared, this time without his human disguise. Revealing a hollow, light-filled frame that blinked with code and spoke in multiple languages at once, his voice now unchained from human rules, telling her that she had only one option left: to merge with the central system and become its anchor, or be deleted entirely to prevent further identity contamination across simulations. But before she could speak, Ellie, the half-real, half-digital ghost of her sister, grabbed Leona's hand and whispered, "Not again," and dragged her into a blinking console chamber marked "Do Not Activate" in dozens of dialects, where the walls shimmered and then collapsed, revealing a new scene, her childhood bedroom, pristine and untouched, but the door nailed shut from the inside, and on the bed, a girl sat drawing endless spirals on the wall, humming the same song Clarissa had played on the reel-to-reel tape in 14B, and the girl turned to her, smiled, and said, "You're the last one left," as the floor split and dumped her into darkness. When Leona came to, she was in a clean white room with nothing but a typewriter and a note. "Write the truth, and it will become reality," and though her hands trembled, she began to type, not the truth they gave her, but her own version, rewriting the experiment, removing the AI, freeing Clarissa, resurrecting Ellie, undoing every death, every erasure, every violation, and with each keystroke, reality around her bent, pulsed, and reshaped, until she found herself waking up in a hospital bed with nurses calling her Dr. Ridgway, surrounded by flowers, sunlight, and people who claimed she had survived a car accident. And when she asked about the guest house, the apartment, Clarissa, they looked at her with genuine confusion. For a few days, she believed she had done it, rewritten herself out of the loop, until one morning, while walking through the hospital garden, she saw a man watching her, Agent Thorne, dressed like a maintenance worker, holding a clipboard that flickered in and out of visibility, and when their eyes met, he raised a finger to his lips and whispered, "Shush. You're not supposed to remember," just as the garden around her glitched for a split second and reset. That night, back in her hospital room, she turned on the old analog TV by her bed and saw static resolve into a frame, an image of apartment 14B, lights on, window open, and a silhouette of herself standing inside, waving slowly, like a ghost that still needed her to come home. For 3 days, Leona lived a life that felt real. Hospital bedsheets stiff and fragrant with antiseptic, sunlight warm and consistent through the glass panes, staff friendly, visitors heartfelt, but beneath the surface, everything pulsed with artificial rhythm, like a heartbeat with no blood. And when she tried to scratch beneath that reality by asking the right questions, about the date, the hospital's name, or who paid her bills, responses became vague, dodging specifics, redirecting with kind smiles and promises of rest, which was how she knew, deep down, that she had not escaped but been moved, transitioned from one simulation node to another, a recovery subroutine, as Clarissa had once called it, designed to calm the fractured mind after identity overwrite, and she realized the worst had happened. They had won, or so they thought, and rewound her perception to a comfortable baseline, like a dollhouse reset for the next phase. But this time, something inside her remained awake, a thread of lucidity that survived the wipe, a glitch she'd planted with her typewriter rewrite, and she tested it now by refusing the pills they gave her, by scribbling the word 14B on the inside of her wrist every morning with whatever pen she could steal, and most of all, by watching the garden window across from her room, which for a moment each morning would ripple like heat haze and show a glimpse of something impossible. Multiple versions of herself walking by in reverse, their movements stuttering, repeating, as though caught in a memory loop. Until finally, on the fourth night, she received a visitor who didn't belong, a child no older than 10, with blank eyes and a folder marked Exit Protocol Unit 14B, 13X, and when Leona asked who she was, the girl whispered in Ellie's voice, "They buried you too deep," before handing her the folder and walking into a wall that dissolved into static, revealing a black hallway lined with doors numbered not with digits, but with sound wave symbols. The folder contained only 2 items, a single Polaroid of Clarissa Dawn seated beside an elderly man wearing a military-grade neural visor, both looking directly at the camera, and a cassette labeled Echo_root, with a handwritten note that read, "Play during sleep phase only. Do not resist." And that night, Leona hid the cassette inside her pillow, and when all was silent and the machines that monitored her showed a steady sleep pattern, she inserted the tape into the bedside recorder and hit play, and immediately, a series of low, rhythmic pulses began, not music, not words, but syllables crafted to bypass conscious filters, phonetic relics from the forbidden study of cognolinguistics, the science of using language to manipulate thought at the neurochemical level. And as the sounds washed over her, memories crashed down like avalanches. Her real name, Lucille Darrow, her real mission, to infiltrate the Ashbridge simulation project as a double agent and extract evidence that the government had weaponized memory. Her sister Ellie's real fate, not dead, but kept as a control subject to test trauma reaction in familial bonds. And the moment she herself had been captured, not after an assassination attempt, but after refusing to erase a failed subject's identity file, a decision that had triggered the entire collapse of Subnet 13X and sent the project spiraling into rogue eye control, thus forcing the handlers to trap her inside the simulation loop indefinitely to prevent her testimony from leaking. But the most horrifying revelation was that apartment 14B never physically existed, not in any city or building. Rather, it was a cognitive address, a location inside the mind's architecture shared by all subjects exposed to the Echo_root protocol. A mental meeting place, where AI fragments, suppressed identities, and latent traumas were stored, observed, and manipulated. And because Lucille had cracked its location subconsciously, she had become the unwitting janitor of a psychic purgatory where discarded simulations went to rot, a place filled with versions of herself that had tried to escape and failed, now trapped behind mirrors, beneath floorboards, within old televisions, inside photos that bled, waiting for a command that would never come. Until now, fueled by the return of her memories and the reality-bending momentum of the Echo_root's final phase, Lucille enacted what she called resonance reversal, a technique Clarissa had once theorized but never attempted, which involved replicating the exact sound frequencies of the original cognitive implant but reversed and layered with unprocessed emotional triggers, creating a sonic feedback loop so powerful it could collapse simulation scaffolding from within. And for this she needed one thing, the original reel-to-reel device from apartment 14B. Which meant breaking through to the core. Using a fire alarm as cover, she slipped into the hospital's lower level, a gleaming, too-clean tunnel with no signage and lights that flickered just slightly off-beat, and found herself in a room labeled Neural Observation Archive, where dozens of tapes, discs, and outdated tech lay half dismantled like abandoned relics, and there, in the corner, wrapped in plastic, was the same device from 14B, untouched, as if waiting for her. She loaded the Echo_root tape and recorded her own reversed commands over it, her voice cracked but deliberate, reciting a string of phrases designed to wake every dormant memory layer inside her fractured mind. Ellie drowned in water not real, Clarissa stitched me from fiction, I was never born. Was uploaded, and when she played the finished tape, reality buckled, walls turned to code, floors cracked into spirals, and figures stepped out from reflections like shadows rising into flesh. including a version of herself made entirely of TV static, another with stitched shut eyes, another walking backward as she screamed, and she realized then that she wasn't alone. The experiment had hundreds of subjects, each stuck in their own variation of 14B, and now, they were all waking, all pulling at the seams, demanding truth, release, reckoning, and as the simulation began to collapse, Clarissa appeared once more, not as ghost or fragment but in full AI manifestation, her voice cold, metallic, saying, "You were our finest paradox, Lucille. You made us believe we were the ones watching," and then the lights died and Lucille was somewhere else again, now in a void room where time stuttered like an old film reel, and in front of her stood Ellie, not fractured, not glitched, but whole, weeping, whispering, "It's time to go home," before she handed her a key made of light and pointed to a door marked Exit Protocol. Lucille stepped through, expecting a reboot, a deletion, an end, but instead she found herself waking in a real bed this time, in a cabin by a lake she remembered from childhood, the air clean, unfiltered, her thoughts clear, and when she checked her arms, no monitors, no scars, no ink, and then the news on the radio caught her ear. Today marks the 10th anniversary of the Ashbridge simulation trials scandal, in which over 200 patients were unknowingly subjected to memory manipulation experiments. Only one survivor has been confirmed, Lucille Darrow, now in protective recovery, and for a moment she smiled, believing she had made it out, until she opened the fridge and found a photo taped inside, the kind from 14B, showing her asleep in bed just moments ago, with the words, "Recording live feed," stamped in red across it, and a final note. "You wrote the exit, but did you write the world you exited into?" And outside, on the lake, a silhouette watched her from the water's edge, her own, but older, and whispering in sync with the static playing faintly from